He slid the folder across the table and didn't bother to look at me. Felix. This company needs speed, not history. Chairs shifted, screens glowed, no one laughed, but no one stopped him either. Ethan Cole liked moments like this clean, public, irreversible. At 32, he mistook decisiveness for wisdom and volume for leadership. I was 58, director of operations, the person who never appeared in press releases. I didn't pitch visions. I made sure the lights stayed on, the elevators passed inspection, the insurance stayed valid, and regulators left satisfied. When things worked, no one noticed. When they didn't. My phone rang first. Ethan talked about image, about youth, about a future that needed new blood. He never mentioned missed targets or failed audits, because there were none. This wasn't about results. It was about optics, about proving to the board that he could cut weight without blinking. The firing was brief and theatrical, a sentence, a nod to HR, an invitation for everyone else to keep watching. I understood the lesson he was teaching the room: loyalty ages badly. I stood up without saying a word, no warnings, no speeches. I'd learned long ago that explanations only comfort the person delivering them. Ethan watched me leave with visible relief, like he'd finally cleared an outdated line of code. In the hallway. My phone vibrated. Not a text, not a call. An automated email, stripped of emotion and mercy. The kind sent when a system updates itself after a decision has already been made. I read it slowly, feeling the sting of the insult settle into something colder. Authorized compliance representative status terminated. For a moment, I smiled, not because I felt vindicated, but because I felt certain. Ethan had removed what he thought was history. He hadn't asked what that history quietly held together. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking. Systems don't argue, they respond. And I had just been officially removed from more than a payroll. The silence behind me felt temporary, like pressure building inside walls no one bothered to inspect. That moment can hit harder than it sounds. How are you feeling right now if it stirred something uneasy? Try turning on a small lamp or adjusting the room lighting to something warmer. It's a quiet way to steady your mood without effort. Where are you listening from tonight? Stay with me and consider subscribing, because what comes next isn't louder, it's smarter, and it's already in motion. They called those years quiet, as if silence meant absence. In truth, they were quiet because someone kept swallowing the noise. That someone was me. I stayed when budgets froze and executives panicked. I signed insurance renewals when underwriters hesitated and premiums spiked, putting my name where no one else wanted risk attached. I handled safety certifications personally, walking inspectors through basements, roofs, and mechanical rooms so operations never stalled. When landlords circled like vultures during downturns, I negotiated leases that held flat, sometimes painfully so, locking in rates for 15 years because stability mattered more than headlines. None of that ever made a slide deck. It wasn't meant to, I was told, more than once, to keep my name off records. Cleaner that way, a former CFO said, smiling like he'd done me a favor. I understood the message. Invisible systems were easier to replace on paper. Then Ethan arrived, young and sharp and impatient with memory. He spoke in metaphors about engines and speed, about cutting weight to run faster. People like me were weight. Experience made him uncomfortable. He called it legacy drag. Every meeting became a rehearsal for removal. The dismissals were small, at first jokes about age, comments about energy. Repeated often enough to feel intentional, each one pressed down harder. I kept working. I kept fixing. I kept absorbing the disrespect because the company still needed holding together. That was my mistake. Ethan mistook endurance for weakness when he told me not to worry about my title anymore. I nodded. Titles had never mattered. Responsibility had. What he never asked was why the rent never rose, why the building passed inspections without drama, why insurers renewed without protest. Those things didn't happen by accident. They happened because I made them happen quietly. deliberately, year after year. The irony is that I wasn't just employed here. I was invested in ways no org chart showed. The lease everyone took for granted sat under an LLC with a forgettable name, one I'd set up long before Ethan learned the word disruption. The paperwork didn't list me as an employee. It listed me as the owner. I carried that knowledge through every slight, every meeting where I was talked over, not as leverage, as responsibility. I believed protecting the company meant protecting the people inside it. Ethan believed replacing me proved leadership. Silence can look like compliance, sometimes. I didn't celebrate after the firing. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even check the news. I went home, made dinner, and slept like someone who had finished a long shift. For the first time in years, the company ran without my hands on the controls. I did nothing the next morning either. No emails, no warnings, no advice offered through back channels. I let the system do what systems always do when a key variable is removed. They pause. By the following afternoon, the pause turned visible. Insurance coverage for the building shifted to pending status, automatically flagged when the authorized compliance representative disappeared from record. Safety certifications followed, expiring quietly, not with alarms but with timestamps. Nothing dramatic happened. Operations simply became indefensible. Ethan reacted exactly as I expected. He demanded fixes immediately, barked orders, scheduled emergency calls. Consultants were hired at premium rates, flown in with polished decks and confident smiles. They talked fast and promised faster. None of them asked the right question. They assumed authority could be reassigned like a password, from a distance. I watched the scramble without emotion. Calm isn't indifference. It's perspective earned the hard way. I knew the process because I had built it. I knew where the dependencies lived and which signatures mattered. The documents weren't broken. They were complete. Calls started coming in, indirect at first. Former colleagues asking what was happening, vendors asking who they should speak to now. I answered politely and briefly. I told them the truth without commentary. I was no longer authorized. That was the problem no one could solve. Every form required a signature tied to a name, and that name was mine. The compliance authority wasn't transferable without consent. The insurance rider wasn't amendable mid-term. The safety file couldn't be revalidated without the original signatory. There was no workaround, no emergency clause waiting to be discovered by an eager consultant. By evening, the mood inside the company shifted from urgency to confusion. By morning, it turned to fear. Ethan still believed volume would force obedience from the system. He didn't understand that systems don't respond to pressure, they respond to structure. I remained silent because silence was no longer passive. It was accurate. The first crack had formed, thin and clean, exactly where I expected it. Nothing had collapsed yet, but everyone could feel it, and no one knew how to fix it. That certainty steadied me. Consequences were now mechanical, not personal. Ethan had pressed a button he didn't recognize. The system answered in its own language, patiently. This was only the beginning. And beginnings rarely announce themselves loudly. They whisper, then spread, until silence becomes impossible to ignore entirely everywhere. If you're someone who looks deeper than most, don't leave. This next part is for you. By the third day. Denial had a voice, and it was Ethan's. He called me early. Too early. With the practiced warmth of someone pretending nothing had happened. Felix, he said, stretching my name. We may have moved a little fast. Let's talk like adults. The tension sat under every word, sharp and impatient. I kept my tone even. I'm no longer authorized. There was a pause, then a breath that tried to sound calm. That's temporary, he replied. We'll sort it out. That sentence explained everything. Ethan still believed authority was something you reassigned after a meeting. He assumed there was a switch, a form, a junior signature waiting to step in. He didn't understand that the system had been designed to resist improvisation. Within hours, lawyers were involved, Contracts were pulled, scanned, highlighted. I heard later that the room grew quiet as pages turned. No emergency substitution clause, no provisional handoff, no language allowing the company to override the original compliance authority without consent. The agreements were rigid on purpose. Regulators prefer certainty to creativity. Ethan called again, his patience thinner. "You can't seriously hold us hostage," he said. "I'm not holding anything." I answered. I was removed. That was the core of his problem. He was fighting consequences, not decisions. He pushed harder, demanding workarounds, threatening audits, hinting at legal action. Each threat bounced off the same immovable fact: the contracts didn't bend. Inside the company, tension leaked into everything. Meetings stalled. Executives whispered. The word building started appearing in conversations where it never had before. Insurance carriers asked questions that couldn't be answered quickly. Safety consultants deferred responsibility upward, where no one wanted it. Then the board began to notice, not the technical details, but the exposure. Someone finally asked why so much operational risk depended on a single name. Another asked who actually controlled the property they worked in every day. Those questions traveled faster than Ethan could contain them. By the end of the week, denial had shifted into something sharper. Ethan hadn't lost control yet, but he could feel it slipping. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was enforcing the rules he'd ignored, and the board was no longer asking how to fix it. They were asking who had broken it in the first place. That question changed the temperature overnight. Denial became strategy. Then fear. Ethan stopped calling me and started defending himself. I didn't interfere. I waited. The building, the contracts, and the silence were now doing the work for me, pressing steadily, exposing every shortcut he had taken. Control wasn't seized with force. It drained away through process, oversight, and questions no confident leader ever expects to answer in public rooms. Questions about money changed the tone faster than any legal memo. Once the compliance issue refused to disappear, finance started digging, and that was when anxiety spread. I wasn't in the room, but I could picture it clearly. The CFO, Linda Parker, flipping through spreadsheets with the kind of focus reserved for bad surprises. She wasn't looking for villains. She was looking for numbers that didn't behave. Rent was the first one that misbehaved. For years, the line item had barely moved. That stability suddenly looked suspicious. Linda compared it against market data, then checked again. 40% below comparable buildings in the same district, with better access, better infrastructure. Silence followed, the kind that comes when a room realizes it has been living inside an exception. Emails followed. Calls stacked up. Someone asked how long the discount lasted. Legal answered with precision the preferential lease expired in 30 days. No automatic renewal, no guaranteed extension. The relief that had carried them through expansion plans evaporated into math. Concern turned into unease. Unease turned into fear. The building wasn't just a place to work anymore. It was leverage they didn't control. Finance ran projections assuming market rent. Margins collapsed. Hiring froze. Projects paused. Every plan Ethan had sold depended on a number that was about to triple. The next question was inevitable. Who owned the building at first? They assumed an institution, then a trust, then a long-retired investor whose name would explain the anomaly. Legal searched registries and shell structures until the trail stopped being abstract and started feeling personal. The confirmation landed quietly. The LLC name matched an old operations file. Cross-references aligned. There was no ambiguity left to hide behind. Felix Moore. I heard about it through a former colleague who sounded shaken. They didn't know, she said. None of them knew. That ignorance explained everything, the jokes, the confidence, the ease with which Ethan dismissed me. He thought the rent was a perk negotiated by someone else, some forgotten favor that didn't matter. He never asked why it stayed low when everything else climbed. Inside the company, the mood shifted again, not to panic yet, but to dread. People started calculating personal timelines. 30 days became the loudest number in every conversation. The building hadn't moved. The walls hadn't changed. But the cost of standing inside them suddenly felt unbearable. I didn't celebrate the reveal. I recognized it. This wasn't revenge. It was exposure. The truth had simply reached the accounting department, and numbers, unlike people, don't care about confidence. They only report what has been ignored for too long. That realization settled slowly, bringing surprise, worry, and unease together. As everyone finally understood, the quiet years weren't generosity at all, but a foundation they never bothered to acknowledge until now silently counted wrong. You're tracking very well. Hold on a few more seconds. This part is for the observant. By the time the emergency board meeting was called, the tone had already flipped. Panic had burned itself out and left something colder behind. Silence. I wasn't invited, of course, but silence carries. It travels through assistants, through nervous emails, through pauses that linger too long on speakerphones. I knew the moment Ethan walked in confident and walked out alone. The meeting started tight and controlled. Financial exposure, lease risk, regulatory dependency. Ethan spoke quickly, stacking explanations like sandbags. He blamed process gaps, legacy structures, anything that didn't have his fingerprints on it. No one interrupted him. That was the first warning sign. Then the questions changed. One director asked why operational stability had depended on a single individual for so long. Another asked why that individual had been removed without a transition plan. Ethan tried to answer both at once and failed at each. That was when two board members spoke up, not loudly, not defensively, calmly. They admitted they had known I was connected to the building, not the details, not the structure, but enough to trust that I would never weaponize it. They said stability had always come from me, even when credit went elsewhere. They believed removing me would be symbolic, not structural. The room went quiet in a way that kills momentum. No typing, no murmurs, just the sound of certainty collapsing. Ethan looked around for support and found none. His authority hadn't been challenged directly. It had simply stopped being reinforced. That's how isolation begins at the top. No votes, no accusations, just distance. The board didn't argue about the facts anymore. They discussed exposure timelines, 30 days, insurance status, lease reversion, risk committees. Ethan tried to re-enter the conversation with solutions, but the frame had shifted. He was no longer the architect. He was the variable. Someone finally said it plainly. This is yours to resolve, not a threat, not an instruction, a boundary. That sentence landed harder than any reprimand. It meant the board would not shield him, not legally, not reputationally, not strategically. If this collapsed, it would collapse with his name on it. When the meeting ended, Ethan left without allies. No follow-up calls, no reassuring messages. Silence again, this time intentional. I sat at home, untouched by the noise, feeling the inversion settle. For years, decisions had flowed around me while I absorbed their weight. Now the weight had shifted upward. The board hadn't turned against Ethan. They had simply stopped holding him up. And in corporate gravity. That difference decides who falls. The silence wasn't peace. It was pressure, gathering quietly, preparing consequences that would arrive without drama, mercy, or witnesses for him and everyone who backed him. I expected the call before it came, which made answering it easier than I wanted to admit. Ethan's voice had changed. It was slower, smoother, wrapped in concern that hadn't existed days earlier. He talked about missteps, about pressure, about how fast things move at the top. Then he pivoted, as planned. He offered me a new title, something broad and flattering, designed to sound essential without restoring authority. He paired it with a salary increase large enough to feel like an apology. "We need experience," he said. Careful not to repeat the word old. The temptation was real, not because I missed the job, but because familiarity always tries to disguise itself as purpose. I let him finish. Silence does that to people. They keep talking until they reveal the mistake. Ethan assured me the board would support the move. He promised autonomy, respect, a clean reset. What he really wanted was time. He needed the pressure off long enough to survive the month. I told him, calmly, I don't want my job back. The pause on the line stretched. Pride crept into his reply. Then what do you want, he asked, already bracing for a demand he could negotiate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't counter with conditions dressed up as favors. I want the company to follow the contract, I said. Nothing more. That answer irritated him. He had expected ambition, not boundaries. He reminded me of everything he was offering, as if value only existed where money touched it. He warned me, indirectly, about consequences. That was the mistake. Confidence turns brittle when it meets indifference, I explained. Once, that I wasn't blocking anything. I wasn't asking for reinstatement, recognition, or leverage. The agreements were clear. Compliance authority, lease terms, timelines. All he had to do was operate within them. Ethan heard refusal as arrogance. He mistook restraint for bluffing. His voice hardened, and the warmth vanished. We'll see, he said, and ended the call. I sat with the phone for a moment, aware of the shift. The offer had been his last attempt to rewrite the story while keeping control, by rejecting it. I had forced him back into the framework he'd ignored. Temptation passed quickly. What remained was certainty. This wasn't about winning. It was about alignment. Contracts don't negotiate with pride. They wait. Ethan had just chosen to test them. That decision would echo quietly, through invoices, calendars, and meetings that suddenly lacked easy answers. He believed leverage was loud. I understood leverage was patient, procedural, and exhausting. Every day he delayed compliance narrowed his options. Every confident statement aged badly. I didn't need to escalate. The structure was already doing it for me, step by deliberate step. It would finish this chapter without mercy, spectacle, or negotiation. Just consequences unfolding naturally. I knew the unraveling had begun when numbers stopped arguing and started shouting. It didn't arrive as a single collapse, but as many small failures landing at once. The preferential lease expired quietly, and without renewal, the rent doubled overnight. Budgets broke first. Expansion plans that had been pitched with confidence were canceled in emergency meetings that ended without decisions. Ethan kept promising fixes, but the math no longer listened. Once costs spiked, everything else followed. Hiring freezes triggered departures, and departures triggered fear. Senior managers updated resumes between calls and stopped making long-term commitments. People who had defended Ethan weeks earlier began protecting themselves. The building stayed the same, but the cost of occupying it became impossible to ignore. I watched it unfold from a distance, calm but not untouched. This wasn't vindication, it was consequence. When the expansion officially collapsed, vendors were notified, investors briefed, and partners quietly backed away. Ethan's vision shrank to survival. That was when the media noticed. A local business outlet asked why a growth company had suddenly halted operations. Another questioned whether the removal of a long-serving executive had created operational risk. By the end of the week, the phrase age bias appeared in print. Ethan denied it publicly. But denial doesn't reverse timelines. Each article added pressure. Each question narrowed his exits. Employees read headlines at their desks and counted days. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't need to. The collapse was already loud enough. What had begun as a personnel decision had become a systemic failure. Chaos doesn't announce itself with sirens. It spreads through calendars and cancellations. The unraveling wasn't fast, but it was relentless. And once it started, no one knew how to stop it. Meetings multiplied, emails contradicted each other, and authority blurred into confusion. Legal teams cautioned restraint while finance demanded action. Ethan stood between them. Insisting control remained intact. No one believed him anymore. The unraveling fed on hesitation. Every delayed choice amplified the damage already done. I recognized the pattern because I had prevented it for years without that restraint. Failure behaved exactly as expected. The company hadn't lost a building yet, but it had lost certainty. Certainty is what keeps people aligned. Once it disappears, collapse becomes procedural. I felt no triumph watching it happen, only a steady understanding that systems, once ignored, eventually collect their due. The press didn't cause the damage, it merely named it, and names have weight from that point on. Recovery stopped being a strategy and became a rumor. The unraveling continued, orderly and merciless, pulling every weak assumption apart while everyone waited for someone else to speak. But silence remained, heavy, unanswered, and irreversible for all involved. I entered the boardroom without urgency. Carrying nothing but a thin folder I never opened, everyone stood when I arrived, not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. Silence had replaced argument, and that silence felt deliberate. This was the final meeting. No lawyers posturing, no threats exchanged, just consequences waiting to be acknowledged. The board asked me to sit, and I did, folding my hands the same way I always had. Years of pressure stayed contained behind my ribs. They spoke first. Exposure, risk, operational paralysis. No one used Ethan's name at the beginning. They didn't have to. He sat across from me, rigid, eyes fixed on the table as if answers might appear there. The confidence that once filled rooms had condensed into stillness when they asked what I wanted. The question landed softly, almost carefully. I didn't ask for compensation. I didn't mention the past. I didn't list sacrifices or injustices. I told them the truth in one sentence. This is what stability looks like. Nothing followed it immediately. No rebuttal, no negotiation. The words settled, heavy but calm. Stability wasn't a slogan. It was a structure they had relied on without understanding. Removing it had revealed everything fragile underneath. One director nodded slowly. Another closed a notebook that no longer mattered. The discussion shifted, not toward me, but toward Ethan. Transition plans, leadership responsibility, reputational damage. He finally looked up, searching for support that wasn't there. The board didn't accuse him. They didn't raise voices. They explained. With quiet precision, that leadership failure didn't require malice, only neglect. His decision had accelerated risk beyond their tolerance. The company needed containment, not confidence. Ethan tried to speak. The chair stopped him with a raised hand. It wasn't hostile. It was final. They asked for his resignation. The words landed without drama, but their weight bent the room. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if rehearsing acceptance. No argument followed. Power doesn't always exit in noise. Sometimes it dissolves under review. I was thanked for coming, not praised, not apologized to, simply acknowledged. That was enough. I stood, returned the folder to my side, and walked out without looking back. I didn't win through litigation or leverage. I won by refusing to interfere while the system corrected itself. Stability isn't loud. It waits, endures, and proves itself when pressure removes every illusion. That meeting ended nothing personal. It restored order. I left knowing the story would be retold loudly elsewhere. But the truth would remain quiet, documented, enforceable, and finished, because stability never needs applause, only time, memory. And people willing to stop pretending control comes from volume alone when experience finally outlasts arrogance and systems remember everything forever. I signed the new contract without ceremony. Market rate, clearly defined standards, no favors hidden between lines. The building returned to its proper place, not as leverage, but as structure. That was the point all along. The company survived, not comfortably, not quickly, but honestly. Systems were rebuilt with respect for limits, and processes stopped pretending confidence could replace preparation. Ethan was gone. His name lingered briefly in conversations, then faded into footnotes where hurried leadership usually ends. I wasn't invited back inside. I didn't ask to be. My role was complete the moment order replaced noise. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like correction, clean and irreversible. I walked past the building one morning and watched employees badge in, unaware of how close they'd come to collapse. They didn't need to know. Stability works best when it's invisible. That had always been my philosophy, even when it cost me. There was no celebration, no victory lap. Relief came quietly, like pressure lifting after years of being held too tightly. I felt lighter, not triumphant. Dignity doesn't require applause. What stayed with me was the lesson the system delivered without shouting. Experience had been dismissed as weight. Contracts had been ignored as paperwork. In the end, neither argued. They simply waited. The world rewards speed until it doesn't. It praises disruption until something essential breaks. Then it searches for memory, for structure, for the people who built foundations without asking for credit. I left that chapter intact, without bitterness, knowing the balance had been restored. Experience doesn't expire. Contracts don't forget. Quiet justice rarely feels dramatic, but it lasts, shaping outcomes long after voices fade, proving that restraint, patience, and memory can outlive ego, ambition, and every shortcut taken in moments of careless power and authority collapses. I didn't walk away from this story feeling victorious. I walked away feeling lighter. What stayed with me wasn't the downfall of one man, but the quiet truth that systems remember what people choose to forget. Loyalty doesn't always shout, experience doesn't always defend itself, and dignity rarely announces when it's doing the right thing. For years, I thought staying silent meant being overlooked. I was wrong. Silence can be preparation. Endurance can be power. The real lesson wasn't about contracts or buildings. It was about knowing who you are when respect disappears, and choosing not to become smaller just to survive someone else's ego. Justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives as balance being restored, slowly, permanently. If this story felt familiar, I'd really like to hear yours. Have you ever been pushed aside, underestimated, or quietly relied on until you were suddenly gone? Where are you listening from right now? If this moment resonated with you, consider leaving a comment, liking the video, or sharing it with someone who might need it today. And if you'd like to stay with stories that value dignity, experience, and quiet strength, subscribing helps keep this space alive. Some stories don't need to be loud to matter, they just need to be told.